It was after 10 o'clock at night when the cops arrived at the Robert Trent Jones Golf Club in Gainesville, Virginia. Pulling up to the majestic Georgian-style mansion that serves as the clubhouse, two officers from the Prince William County Police Department located a member of the staff who agreed to take them to the scene. The employee led the police officers away from the red brick clubhouse, down past the azaleas and presentation lawn towards the banks of Lake Manassas. They reached a spit of land between the 18th green and the shoreline, where a collection of white Adirondack chairs were arranged in a semicircle around a fire pit. The secluded, serene spot was popular with the club's members, who liked to gather there after finishing their rounds of golf. "He's sitting in a chair behind the tree," the employee said. Through the darkness and the foliage, the police officers could make out a solitary figure slumped onto one of the chairs. The man was perfectly placid, facing the water. He was a large man, maybe 6'1", 215 pounds, and his clothes reflected the upscale sensibilities of an exclusive private club that cost about $150,000 to join. The man wore a black sports jacket, a white dress shirt, gray slacks, and black loafers. On the left arm of the chair was a burnt cigar. On the grass next to him, an empty bottle of Petrus, a rare wine produced on a 28-acre estate in Bordeaux that cost $1,500 at the club. As the police officers approached the fire pit, they noticed bloodstains on the man's shirt. They spotted a gunshot wound in his head, and they saw a silver Smith & Wesson .357 pistol. One of the officers put her fingers on the man's neck to check his pulse. His skin, she found, was stiff, and despite the humid air of the summer evening, the man's body was cold to the touch. Welcome to the Wolves of K Street podcast with Brody and Luke Mullins. We're going to be using our book to sort of talk about how lobbying has changed, how the influence game has changed over the years. But we're really going to go sort of chapter by chapter through our book, talking about sort of how the book came together, who the key players are, how influence and lobbying change, and sort of give our own insights and reflect on sort of how the book came together and how we worked on it. This is my brother, Luke. Luke, you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is Luke Mullins. I'm a feature magazine writer here in D.C. I write for Washingtonian magazine, Politico magazine, and The Atlantic, and other places.
And I'm Brody Mullins, Luke's brother. We grew up in Washington, D.C. Strangely, we both became reporters. I worked at Congress Daily and Roll Call covering Capitol Hill for many years, and kind of evolved into covering the influence beat, which I covered at the Wall Street Journal for almost 20 years. Luke and I came together to write this book. Luke, I think it was almost 10 years ago. In fact, Evan Morris,
maybe
Evan Morris died in 2015. So it's almost, and we started on the book afterwards. So we're going to keep reading sections of our first chapter and then sort of break down the book, the podcast, and this scene. So the next part is, on this day, July 9th, 2015, the club's employees were hustling to prepare the grounds for a nationally televised PGA golf tournament hosted by Tiger Woods that would take place in just a few weeks. It was the biggest golf event of the year in the Washington area. Then the body of one of its members was found in a lawn chair behind the 18th green. Back at the fire pit, the police were taking photographs of the body and carefully collecting evidence from the scene. The revolver was secured by removing the unused bullets from the cylinder. One of the officers walked back up to the clubhouse and began interviewing witnesses. The staff had no trouble identifying the deceased man. He was a Washington lobbyist, a frequent golfer, a familiar face at the club. As the server explained to the police, who documented in their report, the lobbyist had arrived at the club around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, entered the bar, and ordered his bottle of Petrus. He left quickly, saying he had work to do. His temperament, the server noted, seemed a bit short. The lobbyist walked down to the fire pit. He took a seat in an Adirondack chair, opened his bottle of Petrus, and peered out at the 770-acre man-made lake. Around 5 o'clock, the server came down to the area. Will he be joining us for dinner? He asked. No, the lobbyist said. I'm white. So Luke and I are launching a book about lobbying, about corporate power, about influence, about how Washington has changed. And what we realized that some of those topics, campaign finance, corporate power, lobbying, influence, are really heavy topics. So what we want to do is write a book that was really light and almost like a mystery. So we start the book with Evan Morris his body on the golf course with a bullet hole in his head as sort of a dramatic way to kind of bring readers into the story. Luke, you want to talk a little bit about how we ended up with this scene?
Yeah, again, as Brody mentioned, uh, the subjects of our book are interesting, certainly to us, and they're very important, but they tend to be dry, right? So the idea was, how are you going to drive a reader through a story like this, right? So, we open with this scene, which is it is just, but it's a dramatic scene. And correct me if I'm wrong, Brode, maybe I'm getting ahead of ourselves here, but we don't identify Morris in this scene. And that's sort of a structural kind of storytelling piece. And the reason is because we're going to be talking about a number of different lobbyists, and they all sort of have various dramatic arcs, and they, get involved in some in drama and scandal. And we didn't want the reader to know which of those stories was actually going to end here, right? So there's sort of two things. One is just the mystery of what happened to this person, and then the bigger mystery is like, who is this person, right? And
It's amazing,
again,
Luke.
go ahead.
I'm just noticing now that in this prologue, we don't mention Evan Morris. I kind of assumed we said
Right.
who it was.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, yeah.
one of the ways we broke down the reporting and writing was probably worth mentioning is I sort of did a lot of the reporting and Luke handled most of the writing. So, I didn't even notice that you had not used his name in here because obviously I knew who it was,
Right.
which is fascinating. So another thing is interesting. Is sort of how we found this guy. So Evan Morris died July 8th, 2015. At the time, I was a reporter at the Wall Street Journal covering lobbying. I had heard about his death through some friends. The Wall Street Journal is a very slow moving publication. So I didn't look into him right away because I thought that his story would be written by Politico or written by one of the sort of faster moving reporters. I remember John Brejan was working on a story on this at the time, and some other folks. So my idea of the journal was like, let's sit back, have people report this early story, and then I can see if I can piece back a broader story. And then a year later, literally in July or August the following year, actually Luke and I were together in Vermont, where we have a family trip every year with our parents and our other brother. And I was sitting there sort of reflecting on like, what are good stories I can do this year, and thinking about, what are some good projects to take on. And I realized that this guy, the death of this guy had never been written about. I searched him up on the internet and no one had written about him. So I thought like, man, let me go back and look into this guy. So I talked to my editor, and my editor said, hey, we're the Wall Street Journal. We're a big national business newspaper. Just because someone on your beat is dead, even in a dramatic fashion with a bullet hole in his head on a golf course, doesn't mean it's a story for the Wall Street Journal. And the smartest move I made as a journalist, I think, was to completely ignore his advice and look into this guy anyway. So that was, I think, the first calls I started making about Evan Morris were August 2016. And it resulted in a front page story for the Wall Street Journal. And as soon as that story came out, I started getting calls from sort of movie producers and book agents. And I remember picking up the phone and calling Luke and saying like, hey, what do you think about, trying to work on a book about this guy? And from there, our book project evolved in many different ways, which we can talk about later. But I think we began saying, let's just write a book about Evan Morris. And we really didn't know what it was going to be about. Do you agree with that,
Yeah.
Luke?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we wanted him as a window into this sort of evolution of modern lobbying, because the tactics, which we can get into later, were very cutting edge, and he was very effective and sort of also very emblematic of how much Washington had changed with regard to lobbying. And he seems to us to be just a great symbol for the modern lobbying.
So did we know right away? I feel like we didn't. I feel like we knew this character, but we didn't know the book. We because remember when we
Oh,
only got a book deal with Priscilla Payton at Simon and Schuster, she sort of set us off to go find out what the book was about.
well, she wanted the book eventually became much broader, right? Initially, the vision that you and I had was about this guy, it very just limited to his life,
Right.
and it was
That's what I
looking
mean.
at the evolution It got much broader for a number of different reasons. But he and the type of lobbying that he represents, was it was the thing that was most interesting, at least,
Yeah.
to the book. I felt like.
Let me get to the next section here. This is reading from the prologue. At about 7:30, an hour or so before sunset, a different club employee was standing on the 18th green when a gunshot pierced the silence. Roughly 30 seconds later, a second blast. I'm sorry, roughly a second later, a second blast. The employee thought it must have come from a hunter on the other side of the lake. He went on top of a hill, maybe 50 yards from the fire pit, and saw the lobbyist sitting alone with a bottle of wine. Assuming that the man had merely passed out, the employee returned to the clubhouse. At 10 o'clock, he sent the server back down to light the fire pit for another club member. Realizing that the lobbyist hadn't moved in several hours, the server went over to check on him. There was a red substance dribbling out of the lobbyist's mouth, which at first the server figured was wine. He shook the man but couldn't rouse him, called the police. Within an hour, a team of county officials had descended on the golf club. Police located the lobbyist's white Porsche sports car in the parking lot and searched for clues. A detective entered the room where the lobbyist was staying. Before long, a medical examiner came down to the fire pit, examined the body, and at 10:52 p.m. pronounced the lobbyist dead. So another great passage from this opening scene, which is intended to draw people in. Luke, you want to talk about how we sort of took this character and the Wall Street Journal story and made it into a book through the proposal process, sort of how that process worked?
Yeah, I mean, generally, in the publishing industry, they're always asking, what does the book say, right? Like, it's not that's what so you got to be able to answer that, right? And again, at the initial stages, when we were just trying to write a book about Evan Morris, it was sort of what we were just talking about. Like, this is a guy who kind of embodied the way lobbying had changed from, the old traditional insider approach to the outsider approach, which we can get into later. And then also, again, these are issues we'll get into later, about sort of how he was able to operate with so much autonomy from the corporate office, right, which was in San Francisco, and how influential, right, lobbyists have become to corporations' bottom line, right? At the end of the day, one of the things what Evan was doing, among other things, was driving sales through government contracts and things like that, right? And again, that's always been a part of the lobbying business, but so much of lobbying in the early days was sort of defensive, right? Like protecting against regulations you don't want to see. And we went through this other period, in the 90s after that, where it was sort of the 80s and 90s, really kind of fighting back against those regulations and then starting to, craft regulations that businesses want. And then this sort of late stage, which is about, among other, driving revenue, right? Like government contracts, expanding market share by the antitrust process as well, getting these mergers approved, right? And again, so one of the things about Evan Morris was he was so valuable because he was bringing in new revenue, right? Which is not something that the lobbying business was really about through much.
One of the people we spoke to, who worked very closely with Evan Morris for many years, said that every year Evan Morris would write an ROI report back to the home office in South San Francisco to his bosses at Genentech. ROI is return on investment, and he said that you gave us X millions of dollars to run the Washington office, and we gave you X billions of dollars. And every year that ROI was 1 to 1,000, as in every time every dollar that went into the office was multiplied by 1,000 going back out through huge government contracts you'd get, through blocking various regulations that we'll talk about later on in the book. So he was an incredibly valuable source of wealth and revenue for his company. That's actually something that Luke emphasized a lot in the book. Is Luke calls it Washington offices as revenue centers, as ways to drive money,
profit
to
centers.
companies.
Yeah, and that's more and more that's what Washington offices have become, in the sense that it's it's no longer just defensive and trying to protect against regulations you don't want, but actually looking for areas of growth.
Yeah. Um, let's also talk about how we reported this scene. This, I felt like we
Yeah.
reported this scene, which we start the book with. We sort of end it mysteriously, right? Not mentioning the lobbyist's
Right.
name and leaving this mystery, like what happened to this guy? Was this a murder? Was it
Right.
like, what went wrong here, in order to draw the readers in? And then we resolve that tension and the mystery later on in the book. But so we'll get back to this scene later on. But let's talk about how we reported, because we were reporting on a guy who's dead on a golf course with no witnesses.
Oh,
As you can imagine, Washington D.C. is such a gossipy place. We got onto this guy a year after he died. So we
yeah.
didn't do any reporting until a year after he died. So for the first year, there's all sorts of rumors going through Washington about what happened to this guy. So when we first started reporting, it was very difficult to figure out what actually happened. Luke, do you remember how we
Well,
started diving into that?
you had records, bro. You had the police records from I forget the county.
Yeah, it took a while. So I remember first talking to lobbyists downtown, and everyone had a slightly different version
Right.
of what happened. Why he was there, what time he died. I remember lots of people telling me that he bought a shotgun at a Walmart, which turned out not to be true. Remember, Luke, people at one point told us that he was wearing his blue club jacket. He put on his club
Right.
jacket before he killed
The,
himself. Turns out the
yeah.
club doesn't have a jacket,
Yeah.
with an insignia. Um, and then what I was doing was, any type of real journalism and investigative reporting, you want to rely on actual records and documents. The Prince William County Police Department was fairly unhelpful. The Robert Trent Jones Golf Course is very prestigious course. We didn't talk about that, but it costs $150,000 to join. It has so few members because they never want a club member to have to wait to play golf. They want to be so empty and so exclusive that if you show up any time of day, you play right away. One of the first things that Barack Obama did when he left the White House was join Robert Trent Jones Golf Course. So it's extremely exclusive, and therefore, the police had an interest in sort of protecting it. I remember that I was sending FOIAs to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, which is a pretty slow process. Also, there was an investigation ongoing. So usually when there's an ongoing investigation, government agencies can block FOIA requests, which I was sending in. Eventually, I started getting some documents. I think at some point I made friends with someone in the FOIA office at the FBI who said there was something like 2,000 or 3,000 pages of documents. And if I requested that, and the way they process FOIAs is they put you in a fast track batch, a medium batch, or a long-term batch, depending on how many documents you're requesting. If I was requesting 2,000 documents, they said the request would take between 2 and 3 years, which obviously is way too long, or at least I thought at the time. If you request 50 or fewer pages, it can take 6 months. So I started requesting 50 pages at a time. So remember, Luke, during this reporting process, I would every 6 months, I'd be like, oh, I got another set of documents. And eventually what we got were the police reports. And the police, a lot of these details, I think, come from the police reports. And even the police reports, though, had some discrepancies. It was very hard to figure out the exact time because the police reports had individuals, officers, raw notes that were written into them. So you had to read 6 or 7 different officers' notes and then sort of compare them to try to pull together the whole story.
There's a lot of information on them, as I recall. There were a number of statements in there, so it was, from a storytelling perspective, it was quite helpful.
Yeah, I mean the details about the gun on the ground and the burnt cigar and what he was wearing and what he had in his breast pocket and all that stuff. Among the most telling things that we actually don't use in this this chapter, but we use later on, is that before he pulled out his gun, he scrawled on a piece of brown paper, "Do not resuscitate."
Yeah.
And which was a chilling detail that I had heard from other lobbyists on the rumor mill, but it just sounded like it could be wrong also. I mean, they already had the shotgun wrong and they had the Walmart wrong. I thought the "do not resuscitate" was just too chilling to be true. And it turned out that it was in the police report. The other interesting thing in the police report is that resuscitate was spelled wrong. Do you remember that, Luke?
I don't know.
In the police report, resuscitate was spelled wrong, and we're trying to figure out, did Evan Moore spell it wrong, or did the police officer spell it wrong, or does it really even matter at all? I'm really not sure how we ended up resolving that one. But
Yeah.
another thing about this scene is Luke and I had never written a book before. Luke is a features writer. I am a more of an investigative reporter. So I'd never written anything this long or this much drama or flair. And so one of the things I did while we were reporting is I was trying to read as many books as possible, literally reading books to find out sort of how to write a book. Like, what is the structure? How do people do it? What are the different styles? And one of the things that we borrowed was from Bloodsport. Bloodsport was the book about Bill and Hillary Clinton's Watergate scandal. And that book, which was about literally like pork futures and derivatives and really complicated financial transactions, opened with the scene of the police finding Vince Morris's body on the side of the Potomac River. And I think we sort of like saw that, at least I remember that as sort of inspiration for how we should start our book. Do you agree with that, Luke?
Definitely. Yeah, no, that was what was in my mind. The difference is that they had Stewart, the writer, he had access. He was talking to
James Stewart's book.
Right. He was talking to the investigators, like they were participating. So he had them. Like I think it was the Park Service, U.S. Park Service that found him because it was on federal land. So I think it was a female cop. Anyway, they were participating. So that was different. That was an advantage he had that we didn't, right? But the effect was the same, or at least our intended effect.
Yeah, and same sort of narrative device where they sort of come up on this dead body in the banks of the Potomac and then explain he's this really important guy, and then kind of get into Whitewater and all the details. Let me read this last part, and then we'll talk about Evan Morse a little bit. About a month later, the autopsy had been performed and the body had been buried. Things took an unexpected turn. On August 12th, a detective from the Prince William County Police Department received a call from a criminal investigator with the Department of Justice. The case, it seemed, was about more than a single dead lobbyist. Few outside Washington had ever heard of the now deceased lobbyist, but in the capital of wheeling and dealing, he was among its most gifted operators. By pioneering an advanced set of influence peddling tactics, he'd achieved crucial policy victories for his clients, secured windfall contracts from the federal government, cozied up with key officials in Congress and the White House, and financed a lifestyle of vacation homes, golf memberships, Rolex watches, fancy wine, and cigars. But when lawyers at his company received an anonymous letter a few months before his death alleging wrongdoing, internal investigators began scrutinizing the lobbyist's business activities stretching back an entire decade. The allegations would touch off a years-long case handled by the FBI and the U.S. Attorney's Office in Washington involving millions of missing dollars, a second Beltway operative, the murky ethics of D.C.'s political influence industry. The suspicions would also set in motion the lobbyist's demise. A few weeks after the allegations first surfaced, his body was discovered behind the 18th green of the Robert Trent Jones golf course. So really, I have not read this in such a long time. It's such like a riveting and amazing way to open a book about lobbying. But so here we're sort of hinting at like, just like the Bloodsport book did, this is a really important guy who's dead. And hopefully readers, you're engaged, you're into this mystery, you want to know what happened. But in order to resolve that tension and figure out what happened to this guy, we're going to have to teach you about lobbying, teach you about how lobbying has changed, teach you about how corporations gained influence from the 1970s to now. So I think this is your idea, Luke. Is it a genius way of starting a book about lobbying?
Yeah, you're just trying to get broader, just referring to this last section, right? And I remember that in the police reports, right? That they just noted that they had gotten this would be the local cops noted that they had gotten a call from, the feds essentially. And that's what it looks like when a small case gets bigger. So that seemed like a good spot to sort of broaden out from this passage here, where it's, we've got this, tragedy involving a lobbyist, and now we're going to get bigger about like how it's actually much, the story is much broader than than one person, essentially. And so
Yeah.
um, yeah, that was the
Yeah,
goal
so
there.
this seems like a good place also to end this first podcast. Speaking of getting broader, the next chapter we'll go through is really our introduction, which is the broadest possible sort of history of lobbying, history of campaign finance reform, an introduction to some of our other characters, which we'll talk about next week. But this is a great way of getting started. Luke, thanks for joining us, and we'll talk to you guys soon.
All right, sounds good. Thanks, guys.